The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Seeking the truth never gets old, even when it hides in the shadows. Immerse yourself in the world of June's Journey, a free-to-play hidden object game set in the roaring 20s. Solve the mystery of the devious gossip spreader and celebrate our 7th anniversary with exclusive events, never-before-seen decorations, thrilling mysteries, and exciting giveaways. The adventure and the gossip awaits. Are you ready for the journey? Download June's Journey today for free on Android or iOS.
Hello, and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and today I'm talking about Joseon Dynasty with author June-Her. And I know I've recommended her books before on this podcast, but just to set your mind back, just so you know who she is and what she's doing. So she's written now 4 murder mystery books that take place in historical Joseon Dynasty era Korea. So her first book was The Silence of Bones, which is about a 16-year-old. They're all about teenage girls solving murder mysteries in Joseon Dynasty era Korea. So the first one is about a girl who is an indentured servant within the police bureau who ends up involved in an investigation. That's The Silence of Bones. Her second book, I'm mentioning this because I bring up a lot of her books during the interview, and I want you to know all the titles and which is which. Her second book, The Forest of Stolen Girls, is about a girl who is trying to solve the mystery when her father goes missing while investigating the disappearance of 13 young women. Her third book, which won the Edgar Award, is called The Red Palace, and that's about a palace nurse and a royal investigator who team up to look up a pattern of grisly murders, and the Crown Prince is the prime suspect. Her newest book, the one we're talking mostly about today, is A Crane Among Wolves, which I won't tell you the plot of because we're going to talk about that during the chat. But I wanted to tell you the context of all the books because they're all set in actual situations that were actually happening in this era and time and place. And when I say era, this is like a hundreds of years long era, if you remember from the Queen Min episode, talking about the Joseon Dynasty. And I love talking to June about her process, how she comes across these sort of interesting, actual real life, true crime situations in history. And then how she finds a way to make a teenage girl be solving a murder in the middle of them. Her books are so good. I was really so delighted to be able to talk to her. So this is my conversation with June-Her about her newest book, A Crane Among Wolves. So I'm joined today by June-Her, who is the author of, well, I guess let's say like 3 books and coming up a 4th book, like coming up just after this episode comes out. Like you can pre-order it and then the book comes out very soon. So welcome, June.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you, first of all, because I read your most recent book and I was like all in a row. I was just like, I can't stop. What's going to happen next? It's very propulsive. And you describe the book as it reads like a historical K drama. And I was like, I was reading it. I'm like, it truly is like that. Like, I was just like, next episode was the feeling I had. But I wanted to talk to you, first of all, just like big picture. So you've written 4 books, all of them about Joseon-era Korea. And they're all about young women. And they're based on real events, not like specifically like the girls you invent are created, I think. But
Yes.
how did you come across these specific settings? Where do you find these ideas from?
In general, I'm drawn to the Joseon period mainly because it's the resources are most accessible. I find personally that the more further back I go in Korean history, just the resources become even more and more difficult. And the general reason as to why I'm drawn to the Joseon period, but more specifically, regarding the books that I write, I always like to say every book that I write is almost like a history class for me. So whenever I'm studying Korean history and I'm like, oh, this is like a really interesting historical event or a really fascinating historical figure, then I kind of use that interest as an excuse to write a book because then I get paid to spend over a year researching. So yeah, every book is a history lesson for me. So whatever event or figure I'm interested in, I write a book about it. And then because I've always been fascinated by the lives of women, I find that the Joseon period was a really difficult time to be a woman, mainly because they upheld very strict Confucian values, which resulted in extreme gender segregation. Kind of like what you see in the Victorian era, the idea of the domestic and public sphere. But it almost feels more severe because yeah, like women, for example, noble women weren't even expected to leave the house. Like it was like you belong in the house, like stay in the house. You have to preserve your purity. So they'd even wear a chango, which is like a veil. But this is only for like unmarried girls. It was the strictest for them. So like it outrages me that women had to endure this kind of restriction. But at the same time, as a writer, it's like we thrive on conflicts, right? And so the mere act of a unmarried girl leaving the house to claim justice for herself or to solve a mystery on her own is an act of subversion and rebellion. And so while it was hard for women back then, at the same time, I really enjoyed trying to figure out ways like, how do I give women agency during this period when they were not supposed to have any? Whenever we study history, we always find women have managed to just escape these kind of restrictions. And so I kind of figure out my own way using writing to figure out ways that women might have just subverted things to chase after whatever it is they wanted. And in the case of my books, it's solving a mystery and reclaiming justice.
Just personally, as a person, mysteries are my favorite kind of books to read. So I'm just excited that that's the sort of books you write as well, with all the history in it too. Because just speaking of K dramas, I haven't watched lots, but the ones that I have watched are all like contemporary police procedural sorts of shows. And so I was like, okay, well, and then I was reading your newest book, A Crane Among Wolves, and I was like, oh, this really feels like that actually. Like it feels like a police procedural crime drama, but set in olden times. So there's that vibe of it as well. Yeah. So part of what you just said is part of what I'm so curious to learn from you as well, is how you find ways for your teen girl characters to be involved, to be protagonists in the story and like affecting change and doing things. And it's often they're in crisis, like in A Crane Among Wolves, like she's had. We'll talk about that book specifically in a bit, but I mean, like, there's some sort of issue like that. Or also in some of your books, they have a job that kind of leads them to this investigation. And I found that really interesting. Can you talk about the Red Palace? So she's got a job as a palace nurse. Can you talk about, like, in terms of women being so tucked away and hidden, but there are these jobs that are required, and that's because of the gender split, right?
Yeah, so the book kind of revolves around the historical figure Crown Prince Hado, who is one of the most controversial princes in Joseon history. And so I didn't want to write from his point of view, but I wanted to somehow touch on that historical event. So instead of doing it through the eyes of, like, for example, another princess, I'm also interested in the lives of marginalized women. So I'm like, okay, how can I create this feeling of me and also readers looking at history through a keyhole? And so I I went down the list of all the servants and palace women in the palace. And then I thought of the palace nurse called an Inya, mainly because these palace nurses were among the few that actually had the permission to come in and out of the palace. Whereas most palace women, they had to remain in the palace and they rarely had the opportunity to live. And I felt like if I'm going to write like a police procedural in Chosun, a woman who could go in and out of the palace and also interact with investigators. So that's how I figured out that I wanted to write about palace nurse. And I find them so fascinating because this profession developed not from being like, yeah, let's empower women, let's involve them in the workforce of like healing people. It was more like, okay, men are not allowed to touch women whom they're not related to or like married to. And so there were cases where female royals would be dying because they'd be like, I don't want a male physician to tend to me. And so this is when, around the 14th to 15th century, this is when one of the kings were like, okay, we need to develop some kind of system where we allow female servants to be educated to become medical women. And so they went through one of like really intense training. They had to study things that even like noblemen had to study for tests. And so they were like really educated. And so I found that really interesting. So this is an example where I felt like women were able to subvert like the system they were existing in. So that's kind of how I came up with the idea to use a nurse as a heroine.
And that I find that so interesting because, I mean, it's just when you have such strict gender division, like the ultimate result of that turns into like, okay, well then the only doctors are men and all the women can't get medical care. It's just interesting how that turns around to suddenly like, yeah, to sort of empower these women, but
Exactly.
not. Yeah, which is just such an interesting thing. And then you have a similar thing in your other book, The Silence of Bones, like where you
Yes.
have the police are investigating, but again, it's like there's corpses and
Yes.
only a woman can deal with a woman corpse. Yeah.
So these palace nurses or nurses in general who don't pass the medical exams, they get demoted to becoming a tamo. So that's kind of how I learned of palace nurses early on in my my research. I was just like, oh, okay, so I'm learning about these female servants in police bureaus, and I was like, oh, okay, so like these women were actually trying to become like enter a different profession, and so that's kind of how the two books are connected in a way.
So actually explain that a bit more for people who haven't read that book yet. So the people who they get the training and they become the palace nurses, but people who don't pass those tests, what happens to them?
So there's like different levels of nurses. So there's like the average medical woman who works on common people, and they belong to Hyeminsa, which is like a public medical office. And then the cream of the crop, the girls who are like super smart and ace their tests, they're handpicked to join the palace. So usually it's like the average nurses who work in the common public offices. If they fail, they become a tamo, and it's almost like a temporary punishment period until they do better in their tests, and then they can become a nurse again.
Structures like that, part of what I remember when I was reading about the Choson period, which is like a massively long period, like it's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, because there was this, in that sense, there was stability. And I found that really interesting because if you look at England, for instance, it's just like dynasty after dynasty and people are usurping and taking over. And that brings a sort of chaos to society because you're switching. But what I found when I was researching Queen Min is that the Joseon dynasty was so stable for so long, and that allowed the country to develop in a way that's different from a lot of other places because they had this. I mean, as your books show, there's not always amazing emperors in charge, but there wasn't the constant sort of like invasion and stuff that kind of forces the society to change so they could really develop. And I find that so interesting that even practices like that, like, okay, like what if we need to have women who were nurses. Well, what if they fail their test? Like the fact that even that structure is there, it's just like, it's so, like that can only happen in a society that's been kind of consistent for a long time, I would think.
Yeah, there's like a lot of, it was definitely a society that put education on a pedestal. And though there were invasions, but like Korea always managed to somehow defend themselves, which is surprising because it's like Korea and then you have massive China and like this, like, and Japan trying to like eat Korea up. But yeah, like Korea's always, I think because there's that constant fear of invasion, Korea ended up becoming very focused on like, how do we survive? How do we defend ourselves? So maybe that kind of translated into a very long dynastic period.
And part of that too, I just found interesting as well, because again, I do a lot of research on England, for instance, and there's these constant crises there where it's like, oh no, the king didn't have a son, like Henry VIII or something. It's like, I need to get a new wife so I can get a son. But meanwhile, in Joseon-era, they're like, well,
Yeah.
I didn't have a son, I'll just adopt someone. And then we'll just continue on that way. And it's like, that's sensible.
That's convenient.
That all works really well. Can you talk about the concept of like just how the palace works and how extreme the power of the emperor would be in this era? Like how protected and how much is that, like, to me, just like living today, I'm just like, how much is that like a dictator and how much is that just like, yeah. Can you talk about that?
So in the case of A Crane Among Wolves, that was a different situation where the king became a tyrant. But in most cases, the king has factions. And so you see it kind of like shift from reign to reign. But in some cases, like the reign of King Yeonjo, that was like the 16th, 17th century. I'm really bad with dates. But yeah, in the case of King Yeonjo and other kings, their power is kind of balanced out by factions. And so it's not really like a democracy, but it's like the voices of government officials really matter. And so there were cases where the opinions of government officials would actually outweigh the opinions of a king, and kings would be very like careful, like trying to play the political game of like trying to like get government officials on their side, because that was the only way for them to make decisions. And it was around the time of King Cheongjo, which is like the 18th, 19th century. That's when King Cheongjo was like, okay, like I've seen like his own father die because of the factional power outweighing the power of royals. And so that's when King Cheongjo tries to like shift the system and create new systems so that the word of a king outweighs the word of aristocrats and like faction leaders. And so there's always been factions to put kings in check.
And now for a quick advertising break.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more, sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm. As someone who enjoys trying out different makeup looks but doesn't wear a ton on a daily basis, I like to focus on making sure I have high quality staples. And regardless of your makeup routine, you've probably seen Thrive Cosmetics' viral tubing mascara. I've certainly seen it everywhere. It's in that turquoise tube and it's become my go-to for mascara because it doesn't clump or smudge and it comes off really easily with just water. So that mascara, along with all of Thrive Cosmetics beauty products, are certified 100% vegan and cruelty-free. Their bestsellers have thousands of 5-star reviews, and it's easy to see why. Their products are great. I love a multi-purpose makeup product, and their brilliant eye brightener is perfect to use as eyeliner, eyeshadow, even highlighter. I'd recommend using shade Stella for that. They all have a shimmer, and Stella is this really pretty champagne color that looks great on a variety of skin tones. Something I also didn't know from all the mascara videos I saw is that for every product sold, Thrive Cosmetics donates either that same product, another product that's needed more, or a monetary donation towards 8 major causes, including those impacted by cancer, domestic abuse, and veteran and education organizations. So refresh your everyday look with Thrive Cosmetics. It's beauty that gives back. Right now, you can get an exclusive 20% off your first order at thrivecosmetics.com/thrive. That's Thrive Cosmetics, CAUSEMETICS.com/thrive for 20% off your first order.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. Well, I mean, and that does lead us into the setting of A Crane Among Wolves, because this is what happens when the king becomes a tyrant, and what sort of checks and balances are there. And it seems like not much at that time. But can you explain the history of the setting and who is the king at the beginning of A Crane Among Wolves?
So the king is King Yeonsan, and his deposed name is Yeonsan-gun. So Yeonsan-gun actually means Prince Yeonsan. So once King Yeonsan was stripped of his power, they demoted him to a prince. So that's why people refer to him as Yeonsan-gun. But I'll just say King Yeonsan to avoid confusion. So King Yeonsan, he grew up in a very air quotes, he had a tragic life in the sense that moving back a bit, what happened to his mom was his mom got jealous that her husband, the king, had concubines. And so there was this case where she got really jealous and then she left a scratch on the king's face. And the palace was outraged because you're not supposed to scratch the face of a royal body. So this was considered really scandalous, really outrageous. And so the court politics kind of shifted in disfavor of the queen, and so she ended up being deposed, and then later she ended up being poisoned to death. And so that was what happened. And apparently the palace tried to cover it up so that the next in line for the throne, which was Yeonsan, wouldn't find out about this tragedy. And so apparently they covered it up, but there's this theory that Yeonsan always knew what happened to his mom, but he kind of played along, being like, yeah, I don't know what happened. And when he became king, he actually ruled allegedly decently, for the first 10 years. And one of the theories is that during this time, he was actually amassing his power in order to exact revenge. So he kept quiet, acted like he was a good guy, but he was actually planning a revenge. That's one theory. And I think that theory is possible because in 1504, he just suddenly snaps. And it's because one of the government officials is like, oh, you know what? Your mother-in-law, the mother of the deposed queen, is actually still alive. And he had no idea that his grandmother was still alive. Yeah, that his grandmother was still alive. And so he goes to meet his grandmother, maternal grandmother, and he finds out that that grandmother was still holding on to his executed mom's bloody robe. And so he snaps, and that's when he goes on this huge revenge spree. He like kills all the officials that were involved in deciding to execute his mom, along with the concubines who might have influenced his father to kill his mom. And he apparently killed other government officials who just existed in the palace, because he was like, why didn't you stop my mom from being executed? So he kills them all. He even like exhumes the corpses of officials who were involved and like smashes their skeletons. So he was like, so it's like 10 years of anger like explodes. And I feel like he realizes that he has so much power at this point. That's when he becomes like super messed up, and he turns the Seongyungwan University, which was back then the Royal Seongyungwan Academy, into a brothel. He sets up a bureau to go around the kingdom kidnapping women, because his goal is to have 10,000 female entertainers by the end of his reign. And he manages to kidnap and capture around 1,000 or more. And he also takes land from the people to turn into his hunting ground. So he takes a huge part of Gyeonggi province, which is like a huge land, and he just like makes it forbidden from anyone from entering. What I found really fascinating was he actually puts a plaque he makes his officials wear a plaque that basically says, don't criticize me or I'm going to cut off your tongue and cut off your head. And so the question is like, why didn't the people rebel sooner? But yeah.
And also he forbade, what is it, reading and writing, or just language?
He's like, he once got this letter that was slandering him, and he's like, okay, I'm going to ban writing, and I'm going to ban anyone from learning how to write so no one slanders me.
And he also brought in, I think this is mentioned in your book, but also after I read the book, I was just like, I need to learn more about this. So I also saw he brought in like samples of everybody's writing. So he could be like, who wrote this letter? Let me compare everyone's handwriting in the whole kingdom.
Yep. He was so paranoid. He had everyone who was literate submit 4 pieces of document so that it would work as a fingerprint. And if there was anyone caught like teaching someone else how to read and write, they would also be punished, I think even executed. So it was pretty intense.
Yeah. So this is the setting of your new book. So
fun.
And it's the setting of your book. I'm going to get you to explain it obviously yourself, but I'll just let the listeners know, like, it starts off, he's in this era of being a tyrant, and he's been doing so for a while. Your book is not about the shift from one to the other. So it's just people living in this era where he is this terrifying presence. So like, I'll get you to explain the book, but also just how, like, when you came across him as a figure and you thought, oh, I want to write a book about this. Like, what was your process to be like, how am I going to put a mystery and a teenage girl in this era? Like, how did you come up with that?
Yeah. All right. So A Crane Among Wolves is about a girl who's pretty bratty and selfish and privileged, and she doesn't really care about the state of the kingdom until her sister gets kidnapped by the tyrant king. And so she's on this mission to rescue her sister, and then her path kind of crosses with this morally gray prince who is half brother to the tyrant king, and he is basically fed up by his half brother, and is like, he has to plan a coup. But in order to plan a coup, you need to network, you need to have people on your side. And so while Isa, the female character, doesn't really like the prince and he doesn't really like her, their hate for each other kind of is transcended by their mutual hate for the king. And so they end up working together to rescue her sister and also overthrow the king. So yeah, like when I was just studying about Korean history, I read this passage about how there was a king called King Yeonsan who kidnapped over 1,000 girls. And so first of all, my reaction was like, oh, I didn't know this had happened in Korean history. As a Korean myself, I'm always caught off guard by learning about things that I have seen in K-dramas, historical K-dramas. Like, I've seen King Yeonsan in historical K-dramas, but I never had the historical context. So when I stumbled on it, like all these things I grew up watching, I'm like, oh, it connects now. So that was one thing that sparked my interest. The other thing was, I read the passage about, like how he kidnapped over 1,000 women. And I was just like, how do you do that? Like, why would people let you do that? Because it's one thing for, like, Korean kings were known to have like lots of concubines, but it was more like there was like almost like a custom behind it. Not saying that it's okay, but it was still like a custom behind it in the sense that palace women would be promoted into becoming concubines, or like the king would fall in love and then promote her into a concubine. So there was a system to the madness. But in the case of King Yeonsan, he legit just kidnapped women off the street, like even married women. So it was breaking all the quote unquote accepted custom of making women concubines. And actually, they weren't even considered concubines. They were more like, he treated them more as prostitutes. So they weren't given the same advantage that a concubine might have, because usually in Korean palaces, concubines had authority. They had almost some of the advantages of being a wife. So none of that was given to them. They were just abused and exploited, and it was just horrible. And so I was interested in learning more about this. And I think the biggest question that kind of hooked me was like, what happened to these women after the revolution? So that was something I wanted to find out. And so I'm always interested in writing about women. And so in this case, I was a teenage girl. And for some reason, I really wanted to write this bratty, privileged teenager who is kind of like, I don't care about the kingdom. I don't care about politics. I just want a good life. But then what happens when, the political climate actually starts affecting you? I wanted to see a girl who goes from being indifferent to the state of the country to being a girl who learns to care not just for her immediate family, but for the people in her community as well.
I have one specific question about one thing that happens in your book, and I'm not going to spoil who is involved in it, but there's a scene where there's a man and a woman, and something happens where the man instinctively offers his hand to the woman, and they hold hands, and then they're like, oh no. Was that inspired by the Pride and Prejudice movie with the carriage hand scene?
It's probably so ingrained in me that it came out subconsciously. Actually, before I wrote Korean historicals, I wrote Regency romances. And I think, both for Joseon and Regency, even the Victorian era England, there is that kind of forbiddenness that translates into tension, where it's like even a graze of two hands, it's just like, oh my gosh. So I think, I love that scene in Pride and Prejudice. And I think I always try to find ways to sprinkle it into my books in different ways.
That specifically, I was just like, wait a minute. but it's Pride and Prejudice is not the only thing. You're right that ever did that. I was just like, I was curious. That was the question I wanted to ask you.
Yeah, iconic one.
Exactly. And so I do want to ask you, because this book reads like a historical K-drama. And I think that's where this is your fourth book. And so I think readers have found you because of between your first book and now, K-dramas have become so much more mainstream and so much more popular. Yes. So what's the difference that you see between your first book coming out and now, where you can say this is like a historical K-drama and people are like, great, I love those, versus people being like, what's a K-drama? Like, why has that shift been like?
So huge. I can't say for sure because I haven't like researched into this, but I feel a huge difference. So when my book, my debut came out, like I knew there were fans of historical K-dramas out there, but like I was just like, oh, if only I could find a way to reach them, like just a way to be like, you like historical K-dramas? Like here's my book, but I always felt like this barrier, like it wasn't really like they weren't actually finding it. So I was just like, so kind of like frustrated. But then I don't know if it's because I slowly grew a readership or because like we start to see more historical K-dramas on Netflix. So, the audience just expanded and like more people got to know about, Korean history, and they got more used to like their traditional outfit and the way stories are told. So I don't know if it's because of Netflix or the Korean Hallyu wave, or because, just time just passed. I feel like it might be a mishmash of both. but then now with my book, like my upcoming book, I do feel like I finally found my target audience. Like I always had an audience before, but like I feel like I finally found a way to be like to like reach the historical K-drama fans. And so it's been such an amazing experience, and at the same time I'm starting to feel like what a privilege it is, because it's like, okay, people know what K-dramas are now. So I could like use that as a pitch, and it's such a privilege to be able to just like use a pitch like that. So yeah, that's how I've been feeling.
Well, and because also I want to say this is your fourth book, but your other three all came out during a time when there wasn't live events. They're all listed on your website and on your social media, but do you want to just talk about the launch events and things you have coming up? Because this episode is going to come out, I think, like a week before your book launches. So everybody will hear this and they'll be able to come.
Yeah, I put my books came out during the pandemic, so there were no in-person book launches. Instead, I had amazing like virtual events, but I guess, like it feels almost like a rite of passage for an author to have at least one in-person book launch. And so I never had that experience. And so with A Crane Among Wolves, probably if left on my own, I'd be like, no, I'm an introvert, like extreme introvert. I'm just going to do another virtual one on Instagram live. But my husband's like, he loves events, and he's always like been so excited to have a book launch for me. So he's like, no, like I'm going to organize it all. And so like he recruited like some of his friends. And so he has like a whole team. So he's planning the in-person book launch event at Type Books in Toronto. And then I can't go to, I'm not able to fly over to England. So there's a hybrid event in the UK with the Korean Cultural Center. And I'll be video linked into there. And yeah, another virtual one. Like I was invited to go in person, but I have two young kids. So there's one with the Korea Society in New York. And so yeah, I'm very excited, also nervous, but mostly excited for these events.
No, it's we were talking just before we were recording, but it's such an interesting and strange position for you to be launching your fourth book, but it kind of feels like a debut in that way. It does. To actually come face to face with your actual readers. And so I did want to just sort of like conclude things with a question I had to ask you, which is what K-dramas would you recommend to people who maybe are new to them or maybe just want to learn more about these kinds of shows?
Yes. I believe they're both on Netflix, but I'm not sure if they're there anymore. But I would highly recommend The Red Sleeve. And that was one of the best historical K-dramas I've seen that's portrayed the genealogical trauma that came with the incident of Crown Prince Hado. And it's just, yeah, you'll have to read into it, but it was like one of the most controversial / tragic incidents in the Chosun period, and I really loved how the Red Sleeve approached that event. It has a romance, a love story that I really enjoyed. Yeah, just be warned about the last episode. And there's another drama that I'm still watching, but it's a really powerful and moving Korean drama, and I would highly recommend My Dearest. So those are the two dramas I would recommend.
What's My Dearest? What's that one about?
So My Dearest is set during the invasion of Korea, and it's like a love story involving these two. She's kind of like this bratty girl, privileged girl, and then you see this amazing story arc of her starting to care for those around her, and yeah, it's just set in the time of war. And so I thought it was masterfully done. It won so many awards.
That's wonderful. But also, I hadn't, just mentioning when you said earlier that more K-dramas are on Netflix, I'm like, yes, no, that's the ones that I've watched have been on there. So I feel like that's just making it more, you don't need to get a special stream. Like people who are into it, I know there are like special streaming services you can get to like get even more. But like just Exactly. And there's a show that's on. I'm like, I think I need to get a Viki subscription. That's where I am in my journey. But people who just want to try it out, it's like these are so much more accessible than maybe they were before. So you can just kind of find one that works for you. But thank you, June, so much for talking with me today. I'm such a fan of yours, so it's really exciting to talk to you just in that way. I'm really excited for your new book to come out and for all the K-drama fans to read it and and to enjoy it.
Thank you so much for all the wonderful questions. I had so much fun chatting with you.
So June's new book is A Crane Among Wolves. There's a link in the show notes if you want to purchase a copy of that using my partnered link from bookshop.org. But I mean, you can find this book wherever you get your books. It's a big deal. I'm sure it's in every bookstore right now. Her other previous books, I also super recommend: The Silence of Bones, The Forest of Stolen Girls, The Red Palace. And we didn't bring this up in the episode, but coming out in 2026, she's working on a new book that's going to be a retelling of, or sort of an homage to Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen, but set in Joseon-era Korea. So it's going to be called Adoration. So look out for that. If you're listening to this episode far in the future, if you're listening to this in 2026, go buy that book too. Anyway, I was so excited to talk to June, and I'm really, again, like, her books are so compelling and so good. And everything we talked about with like a historical K-drama, I'm so happy that the fans of those historical K-dramas have found her books. And I'm really so happy to see her thriving in this career path, and that she has her in-person events. You can keep up with her. She has a newsletter, and also all of her events are listed at juneher.com. And when you sign up for the newsletter, she does send you a list of recommended historical K-dramas as well. And I have news of my own to tell you, which is that next week we're starting season 7 of Vulgar History. So more information about that will be dropping in this week coming up. I'll be posting lots of information about what to expect, what the theme is. That's all going to be posted on all the places where you can follow me online, which is basically Instagram at the moment. So we're on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, and also I'm going to be sharing some information on my Patreon, free on the Patreon as well, which is at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. But I mean, otherwise, just like stay tuned next week. Season 7 Vulgar History is kicking off, and I'm so excited. I've been working so hard on it. I'm so excited for you to finally hear all the stories that I've been doing. So I also have a newsletter. Speaking of newsletters, so it's called Vulgar History a la carte. It's a weekly newsletter where every week I share my writing, an essay that I've done about a woman from history. At the moment, I'm going through the Tudor era. So we went through the 6 wives of Henry VIII. We talked about the Tudor matriarchs, and now we're talking about some Tudors who you know from this podcast, the Grey sisters. Lady Jane Grey, Lady Catherine Grey, Lady Mary Grey is where we are at the moment. And you can follow me. The newsletter is also free. If you just go to vulgarhistory.substack.com, that is where you will find that. And you can also support the podcast on Patreon, patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. So I do post some information there for free, like the book club is free, the stuff telling you about the new season is going to be free. And also, if you become a paid Patreon member, so for as little as $1 a month, you get early ad-free access to all episodes of Vulgar History, including like archived ad-free access to all previous episodes as well. If you pledge $5 or more a month, you get access to bonus episodes that I do. So this is like Vulgar Piece Theater, where I talk about costume dramas with Allison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson, as well as episodes of So This Asshole, talking about horrible men from history. And based on some of the people we're going to encounter in season 7, I think I might have to vent at least one more episode of So This Asshole coming up pretty soon. If you want to listen to just specific bonus episodes, those are available. You can just purchase one episode if you just like really want to hear us talking about the road to Wellville, or talking about Brotherhood of the Wolf, or I, Claudius, which is our next upcoming Vulgar Piece Theater. You can just purchase that for $5 without becoming a patron member. And that's also available to do at patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter as well. We also have our beautiful brand partner, Common Era Jewelry, which is a 100% woman-owned business that makes beautiful heirloom pieces inspired by women from history. So these pieces are made entirely in New York City. So everyone involved has healthcare and good wages. It's a company I'm really proud and happy to be partnered with. The designs are inspired by women from history as well as from classical mythology. So they have their latest collection is all about difficult women. So this is people we've talked about on the podcast: Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina, who's someone who also appears in I, Claudius, which I've been watching. Anne Boleyn also snuck her way in there, as well as mythological women like Medusa and Aphrodite. Sappho is also there. There's also beautiful hair bows and scrunchies and things. And Vulgar History listeners can always get 15% off all items from Common Era by going to commonera.com/vulgar or using code vulgar at checkout. And actually, speaking of brand partners, so I do also have a bookshop at bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is an alternative way to buy books online without using major corporations that you might be thinking of. And so the thing with bookshop.org is that a little bit of money when you use my link is it goes back to support me and this show. But also, this is where I just found their interface really helpful. I talk about books on this podcast all the time, like today, June Her's books, but also if you want to look up the books and other author interviews we've done, or just books I've recommended, books that I used as reference for previous seasons. If you go to my bookshop.org page, there's lists for all those. There's a list of authors interviewed in vulgar history, historical fiction I recommend, all the books I used for season 6. There's something about Mary Queen of Scots, all the books I used as research for the International season. Like they're all, I try to make it organized as well as I can. I am, you may not know, a librarian. So organizing books is kind of just in my nature. Anyway, and I do have a list that's going on for season 7. So you can get some clues there, what that's going to be about, although I am going to be announcing it super soon as well. And we also have Vulgar History merch. If you want to represent the Tits Out Brigade, you can get that at vulgarhistory.com/store. Or if you're outside the US, you can also shop at vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. Just the shipping is a bit better at Redbubble if you're outside the US. You can get in touch with me, and I do always like to hear back from you. I'm not able to always respond to everybody, but I do try my best to read every message. So, and I do like to hear suggestions from you of new people who might be interesting to talk about on the podcast, or authors who you think would be good for me to chat with. Or if you live somewhere where I've talked about or you visited one of those places, if you want to send me pictures, because I'm not a well-traveled person, I like hearing secondhand from other people who actually are able to visit these places. You can get in touch with me. There's a form at vulgarhistory.com, or you can email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com, or just send me a DM on Instagram as well, where I am at vulgarhistorypod. Transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. You just click on the episode you're looking for, and the transcript should be there if it's one of the ones we've done so far. Thank you so much to Aveline Malik for providing these transcripts. Next week, season 7 kicks off. So, I mean, you know, you got to get your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is researched, written, and hosted by Anne Foster. That's me. The editor is Christina Lumagi. Theme music is by the Severn Duo. The Vulgar History show image is by Deborah Wong. Transcripts are written by Aveline Malik. Find transcripts of recent episodes at vulgarhistory.com.
Talmor, Sheshin Marachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Nowadays, trends and news cycles change faster than we can blink. But there are some things that withstand the test of time. And if you're looking for a connection to something timeless, and maybe also a glimpse of life at a slower pace, I believe everyone can relate to the very human experiences explored in Jane Austen's novels. And that's where I come in. My name is Alison Larkin. I'm a writer, comedian, and narrator and host of the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin. I spent a lot of my childhood in the part of England where Jane Austen lived and wrote, and now that I live in the States, nothing gives me a sense of homecoming quite like narrating her books. On this show, you'll listen to award-winning narration. I'll give myself a pat on the back for that, as well as conversations with actors, writers, and other fascinating people who all share a passionate love for Jane Austen. So please, join me as we embark on a wonderful journey through Jane Austen's work. Be sure to listen and subscribe to the Jane Austen podcast with Alison Larkin, wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys. And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.